A quick introduction into rigid body dynamics in Blender. I have an extremely simple scene with a cube and a grid, and I want the cube to fall on the grid. So to make the cube a dynamic object, we have to go to the Physics tab, that's right here, and we have to add a specific kind of physics, and we want to do a rigid body. It's an active rigid body by default, which means if I now, let's pull this up a little, if I hit spacebar, it will fall down. Shift back arrow gets you back to frame 1. You need to do that a lot when you're doing physics, because you always want to adjust the physics on frame 1 and then hit spacebar to play it. So this is a dynamic rigid body, but the grid isn't anything yet. We want it to collide with the cube. You might think we want to do collision, but that's for particles. We also need to make it a rigid body, but by default that means it will also fall down. So we need to turn off the dynamic on the rigid body for the floor, and then the cube will fall down. It's not very exciting because it just drops and sticks. To make it more exciting, we might want to make it, in a surface response, make it bounce. Does that work? Let's see. Not really. Why not? Because the floor doesn't have any. Oh, why not? Because I adjusted the bounciness on the floor, not on the cube. So let's go to the cube and give that some bounciness too. Rewind, play. Boom, and now it bounces. If I turn off the bounciness on the floor, it no longer bounces. So both need bounciness to get a bounce. Friction obviously determines how much friction the objects have. That's very important when you go into sliding. And if we pull this thing up, let's actually do that on frame 1. Let's pull it up and let's rotate it a little, and we get a much more interesting effect. So that's the basics of doing rigid body dynamics in Blender. Let's rewind and let's add a different object. Let's, for instance, add a monkey. There's a monkey. Oh, it's looking the wrong way, so let's turn that monkey around. RZ to rotate around the axis. And maybe we want to scale it up a little. Oh, that's a big monkey. There's a monkey. So let's make that a physics object. So we're in physics still. Add a rigid body to it. It's an active rigid body, and it will also fall down and collide. Give it a little bounciness. Oh, I like it really bouncy. Monkeys are really bouncy. 1. The way the collisions are calculated is determined by the collision shape. By default, it's a convex hull. That's a shape that fits around it but closes off any holes that might be in it, any concave shapes. It's, of course, much more efficient to have it just calculate a box. Let's see what happens. It explodes because it's actually intersecting with the other cube. Oops, it's intersecting with the other rigid object. And if you have rigid bodies intersecting, they push each other away, and the whole scene seems to explode. So I just make them no longer intersect. You go away. So it's much faster to calculate, but it's not very interesting to use a box or a sphere as a collision object. You can also use the actual mesh, the slowest way to calculate and also not quite as stable. So convex hull usually that's a default and usually is good. For this cube, of course, a box is completely adequate. So in order to speed up the calculations, we're going to set that to a box. And there's our fun physics calculation. And of course, we can put more objects in here. Let's take this monkey and Shift D, duplicate it, and we got 2 monkeys. And when you duplicate it, it duplicates the physics settings. Let's go back to frame 0, and now we've got 2 monkeys falling. So what else can we do? We can, of course, add more monkeys. Now, what happens if we edit an object that already has rigid body dynamics attached to it? Let's find out. I'm going to take my cube. I'm going to hit Tab to get to edit mode, hit 1 to get to point mode, take a point and just move it out. You'll see that there's a box that's growing as I do this. That's actually the collider, because the collision shape on this object is set to box. So if I pull that point out, the collision shape is now much larger, and if I play this, of course, after leaving edit mode, back into object mode, if I play this, it will now collide with that big box, which doesn't make much sense. So in this case, we need to change the collision object to at least convex hull. Now if we play it, it will collide as if it were that new shape. Let's take it one step further. Let's hit 3 in edit mode after hitting Tab, extrude a shape, maybe make that a little bit smaller, and then move it, maybe here. So now we got a kind of interesting weird shape. Let's see what that does. Let's hit Tab again, leave edit mode, make sure we're on frame 1, and hit play. It works. Yay! The object is set to convex hull, meaning that this hole will be filled. And we can show that if I look at the top view for a second. I'll pull this over here and make it fall into that hole. So the monkey should now be falling into that hole. Now let's see what happens. It actually hits the convex hull, not the mesh itself. So it doesn't fall through the object, it just slides off a surface that's been created to fill in this concave hole. So to have it actually fall through there, you do need to make that object collide as if it were a mesh. And then things explode. That unfortunately happens on occasion because mesh collision is not as stable. This object happens to also be set to mesh. If I set that back to convex hull, we might get a better result if I hit play. And we do. Choosing the right shape for your collision determines how efficient you are working. If you set it to box or sphere, the collisions are much faster to calculate, but sometimes you just need to set them to mesh in order to get the collisions you want.